You know, Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
On the Jordan Harbinger Show, you'll hear amazing stories from people that have lived them, from spies to CEOs, even an undercover agent who infiltrated the Gambino crime family. You're about to hear a preview of the Jordan Harbinger Show with Jack Garcia, who did just that.
My career was 24 out of 26 years was solely dedicated working undercover. Now I walk in, I'm in the bar. Now there's a barmaid there, good-looking young lady. She's serving me a drink. Hey, what would you like? Usually my drink was give me a Kettle One martini, 3 olives, glass of water on the side. I finish the drink. The guys come in. I'm going to go in my pocket, take out the big wad of money. Bam, I give her $100. If you're with the mob, I say, hey, Jordan, you're on record with us. That means we protect you. Nobody could shake you down. We could shake you down, but you're on record with us.
For more on how Jack became so trusted in the highest levels of the Gambino organization, check out episode 392 of The Jordan Harbinger Show.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work and comparing rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try, and you might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy.
All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare, so it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates. Quote at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we restart the timeline and everything turns upside down in the Leo Schofield case. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my cheery co-host, Alice. Are you feeling cheery today?
Yeah, I'm cheery today. Why not? It was, a lot of you are probably facing this at school. It's like the 100th day of school, which apparently is like a holiday now. My kids wished me happy 100th day of school.
Is that right?
Yeah, and one of the activities, which... thanks, teachers, was gluing 100 Cheerios on a piece of paper, which meant there were 1,000 Cheerios on my ground.
Wow, that's wild.
So cheery is actually like the perfect descriptor for today.
Cheerio.
Cheerio. Cheerio, mate.
Cheerio, mate. Well, happy 100th day of school to all of you. Who knew this was a holiday, or yesterday, I guess, or Monday, whatever it is.
It was earlier this week, but
yeah,
not today. I know it's Saturday.
It's a month of 100 days.
It's a month of 100
days. Like Christmas. We celebrate it, for a while. So,
exactly.
All right, Alice, we got a lot to get through today. We are going to
and we are committed.
Power through. We got
it's
a lot to say.
one of those things where we're like, we will finish it in 8 episodes. And we will. These 8 episodes just might be like 20 hours long.
Exactly. There you go.
Well, the first thing we need to do is always to correct when we're wrong, which we're always willing to do, by the way. True.
And we are on occasion wrong. And I was thinking about Linda Sales earlier this week, and I realized that we, in fact, are wrong. And I'm not so small a person, I can't admit when we got something wrong. We said in one of the very first episodes, either the first or second episode, that Linda remembered the time that she saw Leo carrying out the item from the trailer because that was the time she always came home. In fact, it's the opposite. We were wrong about that. She remembered it because she came home early from work. Now, this might sound worse for Leo because it seems to narrow down to a specific day when she actually saw it. But she also remembers that the night this happened, the night she spoke to Alice Scott about Leo carrying something out to her car, it wasn't the night that Michelle died. She didn't work that night. In fact, it was about a week before. Now, you may wonder, if that's true, number one, why did this testimony even come in? And number two, why did the defense do a better job of pointing all this out? Well, the first reason, and if you read the testimony, it's very vague. If the defense had challenged this would have been a major blow to the prosecution's story. The problem with the defense is they didn't actually investigate anything. So Jack Edmond, he does a good job at times of cross-examining people using sort of the standard attacks. And he can be very effective. But there's a pretty good argument, I think, for Leo that Edmonds was an ineffective counsel because he did not investigate anything. And that's one of the big ones people will use in appeals. If he had really looked into this, if he had talked to Linda Sales beforehand, if he had broken this down before she got on the stand, I think he would have been much more effective. He actually raises some of this stuff in the cross-examination, but you really have to be paying attention and sort of stitch it together in your own mind to recognize that she is saying, even when she testified, that it wasn't the night Michelle died. But he never actually asks that question. He just establishes that it happened about a week beforehand without ever tying it together, without ever wrapping it up. It's really kind of a mess. And it's just unfortunate for Leo that Edmond his approach did not include things like investigating the case before he started talking.
And I thought we did say it was that she remembered it because she came home late. But what we didn't dive into was that her own testimony was vague. It didn't make any of those ties. So the prosecutor kind of threw it out there with a lot of implicit, I guess, jumps to conclusions, which Edmonds did not challenge. Which then, if you don't have her basically clarifying that this did not happen on the night that Michelle died, then it's not in evidence. And that's the problem with...
I like your effort.
I'm trying to save you, Brett.
Yeah.
But that's a really good point because we see this actually happen a good bit. This is why cross-examination is a really important thing to do, and the right to cross-examination is important because we often have direct testimony kind of just throwing out a bunch of things that you have to draw a lot of implicit lines to reach the conclusion that whatever side is telling the story wants you to hear. And cross-examination points out that these are implied lines of reasoning. And oftentimes when you ask the direct question, did A lead to B, or was A happening on day B? The witness will say, no, of course it didn't. But you can imagine how it's like, well, I saw him carrying out something. Was it the same day that we're talking about here? Oh, no. No, I wasn't even trying to make that assumption. But unless they say it, it's not in evidence. And so cross-examination is actually a really exhausting, it's probably my most exhausting part of trial because you have to listen to every single word and like not miss anything and also follow the arc as well as know all the details within it. It's kind of like you have to know the forest and you have to see the trees at the same time to be able to recognize what's out of place in order to point out and also tactically what you should do, because if you ask the question and don't know the answer, which you typically don't know in cross-examination unless they've said something contrary, in which case it's impeachment, you're taking a risk and you have to decide it's a calculated risk. Is it worth it because I might get an answer that completely puts the nail in the coffin for my client? Or do I, this isn't adding up. I want to kind of explore this and take that risk and it might pay off.
I don't like doing it because I don't like to be mean to people, but that's just me. And Alice, I appreciate you trying to blame it on Jack Edmond, but we totally got it wrong. So it is my fault. I did it. That was my fault. So I take the blame.
It was a long trial. There was a lot of things going on.
It was a long trial. Exactly. The other thing I want to talk about is the actual conversation with Alice Scott, that Linda Sells supposedly had across this fence. If you're thinking, well, maybe she got the date wrong twice. Maybe, in fact, she actually did talk to her that night. Well, it's not what you'd expect, given what Alice told the police she had just seen and heard. Here is her testimony describing this. And I walked to the fence, she came on out, and I say, Alice, I said something weird. I just seen something weird. And we're always joking around about things, being scared and all that. But I said, I wonder if, Michelle's up cleaning or something, I said, because the light was on. And I said, I just seen him carrying out something. And she says, she just started laughing. She said she's seen the same thing. And she said, you better get in that house, She was just trying to scare me and stuff. And I said, okay, I was laughing. I said, I hope it ain't nothing bad, And I went on in. Now, if Alice Scott had just heard Michelle screaming, no, Leo, no, and believed something terrible had happened at the house, maybe her response would be laughing and joking with Linda Sells. But it certainly doesn't, it's not what you would expect. If that was the night this conversation happened, you would think it would have been a little bit more serious than she presents it. Alice says that when she heard this, she actually went to her husband because she was so concerned and kind of woke him up and said, I think something's going on. And he told her to stop being nosy and go back to sleep. So the difference between how she apparently felt when she talked to her husband and when she talked to Linda is so stark. And it makes you think that Linda probably is right, that this happened on some other day when you didn't have that preceding event of the screaming and her saying, no, don't. That makes more sense with the way Alice is talking to Linda.
And if in Alice Scott's telling that she was worried about Michelle because she's the one screaming, no, Leo, no, by Linda's telling, she's saying, oh, maybe Michelle's cleaning or something, not indicating that Michelle's hurt or anything's wrong, but that they're doing something that is wrong together, Michelle and Leo, right? That's kind of the implication of the story. That's very vague. We can't really tell, but she doesn't say Michelle must be hurt. She's saying, oh, Michelle's probably cleaning up something because Leo's carrying something out. Is all this implied within Linda's testimony?
Okay, so that's Linda Sells. We could probably talk about her for a while, but let's get into the timeline. Are you ready to move forward in the timeline, Alice?
Very rarely do we have two timelines in a case. I think we've never had fully two timelines in a case. And certainly you typically don't have another timeline after the end of trial and many decades have passed. But this case, we told you at the very beginning, has it all. And boy, is this second timeline one for the ages.
So before we go forward, let's go backwards. April 11th, 1985. This is about 2 years before Michelle is killed. On that day, Jewel Johnson, a 75-year-old woman, is hit over the head and strangled in her home. Rolls of coins are stolen. Jeremy Scott, a local 15-year-old with a penchant for violence who had been staying with Johnson, is found with some of the coins missing from the home. He is arrested and tried for murder. But he claims that Johnson's son, who had also been living there, actually killed Jewel, and that Jeremy just took advantage of the situation to steal some property. He is acquitted, though he'll actually end up serving some time for an arson charge for setting his bunk on fire while he was detained, which seems like a not smart thing to do, but whatever. Some of the jurors will later explain their verdict by saying they were swayed by the lack of Jeremy's fingerprints at the scene. They simply did not believe that Jeremy had the intellectual ability to know to wipe down the scene to eliminate fingerprints. By the start of 1987, Scott is out of prison, and he is back living in a trailer park less than 2 miles from where Michelle's body will be found.
Really quick, if you guys have been following us for the last 6 episodes, you might be thinking, what? What just happened? Who are we talking about? Who's Jeremy Scott? Exactly. This is not someone you've heard of before.
And he is not related to Alice Scott. This is another point. At some point, the prosecution actually looks into this to see whether there's a connection. There is no connection. Scott's just a common last name. So that's April 11th, 1985. February 24th, 1987, Michelle is killed. On April 10th, 1987, someone shoots a cab driver, Joseph LaVere, in Intercession City, Florida, an area which Jeremy Scott was familiar with. A suspect is arrested, but he is released after 2 mistrials.
Now, November 1st of 1988, so about a year and a half after Michelle is killed, Jeremy Scott and Brian Hall, another new character so far that we have not talked about, go to Donald Moorhead's trailer to collect some money that Scott is owed. The 3 men sit around drinking beer and smoking marijuana. Moorhead begins to make sexual advances to Hall, but Hall rejects them. Eventually, though, Donald Moorhead falls asleep in his chair, and Jeremy and Brian look for money in his trailer. Finding none, they decide to steal Donald's car. Jeremy Scott tells Brian Hall that they have to kill Donald Moorhead, lest he turn them in for stealing the car. So Jeremy Scott smashed Moorhead's skull with a heavy bottle, and Hall took a turn with the bottle as well. But the thing was, Moorhead wasn't dead. So Jeremy Scott took the next step, which is to strangle him with a telephone cord. Scott then wiped his fingerprints from the bottle, and the 2 men left. But it wasn't long before both men were arrested. Brian Hall testified against Jeremy Scott. Brian Hall received life in prison. Jeremy Scott was also convicted, and he got the death penalty, the chair. Though his death sentence would eventually be overturned due to a flaw in the trial judge's application of the law on mitigating factors. So he gets off on a technicality, even though he is convicted for Donald Moorhead's murder. Fast forward quite a few years, 2004. Remember how there were fingerprints found in Michelle's car, but interestingly, they did not lead back to either Michelle or Leo, who owned the car and drove it regularly, indicating that someone had wiped down the fingerprints in that car. But at the time, those fingerprints were unidentified. You know, the DNA, the fingerprint technology, and also databases just didn't exist in the way that they do today. However, they preserved those fingerprints, and technology continued to evolve. Databases started to be put together where you can put fingerprints into databases, kind of look across the nation to see if your fingerprints ever hit anything. And in 2004, the fingerprints that were found in Michelle's car that had been unidentified since her murder are now identified. They are none other than Jeremy Scott's.
All right, so that's all we got today. See you guys next time.
I mean, let's actually stop for a moment. This is absolutely wild. So Michelle is killed in 1987. Nearly 20 years later, the fingerprints have just been hanging out there. No one can argue what they are because they're just unidentified. Maybe they're errant. And we've talked about this. There's going to be fingerprints on a lot of places. It could have been a mechanic that changed, the oil, and for some reason those are the only fingerprints there. Someone coming by and putting their hand on the windshield may leave fingerprints. To have the fingerprints come back to a known killer is what we always talk about, right? We always talk about, okay, guys, beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean that there's any possibility of some serial killer out there that could have done this, even if they didn't live in the area, have no tie evidentiarily to the crime scene, and there's they're not even in the same time frame, right? All of these things. But to have a fingerprint come back to a known killer in the area who was active around the time Michelle was murdered, that is very interesting. This is the type of evidence that we talk about that does start to make alarm bells go off. This is not throwaway evidence. So, 2004, Jeremy Scott's fingerprints ding across the system as the fingerprints on Michelle's car. These fingerprints are on the inside of the windshield, not the outside. So he was inside of her car in order to leave these fingerprints. And they're also on a piece of paper in the hatchback area of the vehicle. So his fingerprints aren't just in one area of the car, but they're in two, pretty as far as you can get in the car, two opposite ends of the car. And that's it. Literally, that's it. So 2004, they identify it as him, and they're like, hey, now we have a name to these fingerprints. We're good.
And I know y'all are all assuming that at that point they're just going to let Leo Schofield out. In 2004, when they find the fingerprints. That is not what's going to happen.
That is not what happens whatsoever. In fact, nothing happens. Leo is still in jail. He's still convicted. And Jeremy Scott is still serving time as well for Donald Moorhead's murder. In fact, nothing happens for about 7 years. So there's procedural back and forth. It goes on for 7 years. And finally, Leo gets an evidentiary hearing about Jeremy Scott's fingerprints. And Jeremy Scott testifies at this hearing. Now, there could be lots of reasons why someone's fingerprints are there. And if his fingerprints are on the inside of the car in 2 different areas, basically, he's going to need to testify as to what happened. And he does. Jeremy testifies, and he gives his explanation as to why his fingerprints are found back in 1987 in Michelle's car after she's found dead. So here's what he says. Jeremy says that he was just trolling around the Lakeland area for abandoned cars he could break into and steal from. He said he came upon the abandoned Mazda, and he does what he did a lot during this time period. He stole the speakers and a power amp. That's an easy crime. Sell it on the black market on the street for a couple bucks. Easy money. And he says that's why his fingerprints were in the car. He did not kill Michelle, he says. And after his testimony, the trial court who held this evidentiary hearing found Jeremy Scott's testimony to be credible. And the appellate court found that the other evidence entered at the evidentiary hearing, including Scott's history of violence with women, would not have been admitted at trial.
And we're going to talk a lot more about this because I'm sure you have all sorts of questions rolling through your head as we go through this timeline. But the reason this is important is once you're convicted, having your conviction overturned is a really high standard. And basically, you have to prove that the evidence you've discovered, the newly discovered evidence, would essentially there's no reasonable jury, had they heard that evidence, would still convict you. And one question is, what is admissible and what is not? So the fingerprints of the other person are obviously admissible. One of the big questions for the evidentiary hearing is some of the violence we're going to talk about, whether or not that would have come in at the trial. And remember what we said all the way back in episode 3, I think, 2 or 3, about 404B evidence. Leo's history of violence is obviously admissible because it's with the victim. The question is, would Jeremy Scott's history of violence be admissible if it wasn't with the victim? And I don't know. I actually think this is a really interesting legal question. If we have time, we can talk about it some more. The appellate court thought it obviously would not be admissible. I think there's all sorts of reasons it could have been admissible. Absence of mistake. I mean, there's lots of reasons under 404B why something would be admissible. You know, means the way you do things.
And it's an interesting parallel, right? Because we've talked about how obviously the prosecution brought in a lot of witnesses to talk about Leo's violent background, which is part of the trial record, and the appellate court knows that. Leo is the one charged.
So let's talk a little bit more about Jeremy Scott. If you've listened to Bone Valley, and now that you've listened to this episode, you know Jeremy Scott is the enormous elephant in the room in this case. This case is interesting without Jeremy Scott. There's all sorts of interesting legal questions, and you can debate whether or not Leo's guilty. And then Jeremy Scott walks in the room, and all of a sudden, you know, what Alice said and exactly when she said it seems to pale in comparison to the question of, what do we make of Jeremy Scott? He is a convicted murderer of one, almost certainly a murderer of another, and a good suspect for the murder of the cab driver. We're not going to get into all that because we're not talking about that murder. But if you listen to Bone Valley, you'll hear some evidence on that in that case. So he lived a life characterized by violence, rape, and theft before he was eventually sentenced to life without parole. Those fingerprints, the one the state never tested, when they finally were tested and came back to Jeremy, it was a bombshell, one that Leo's team thought was, this is it. You know, we're done here. Leo's going to be out of prison in a couple months. Obviously, that's not what happened. Now, Scott was troubled in many ways. He is mentally impaired. He suffers from adjustment disorder, attention deficit disorder. He has brain damage from an accident while he was a child, and he is intellectually disabled. In fact, his death sentence was reduced to life without parole after an appeals court reviewed whether he was too intellectually disabled to be executed. The court rested its decision on some procedural errors, but it's pretty clear that Scott's intellectual deficiencies were at the top of the court's mind. Scott's mother abandoned him as an infant, having no interest in him at all. In fact, the brain damage he suffered was supposedly from when she ran over him with her car on purpose. He bounced around from family member to family member. His uncle abused him, and his grandparents ended up raising him. So Jeremy Scott is sort of the prototypical person who is going to probably live a life of crime and violence and end up in prison. We see this all the time. He was really a ticking time bomb. So, did he have anything to do with this crime? As we've said a million times, as we said with Leo, just because you've done bad things, even if you're a bad person, it doesn't necessarily mean you committed this specific crime. So let's break it down. Let's take a look at the evidence.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really kind of good warning, caution for anyone to jump too quickly, right? Oh my goodness, there's a match on the fingerprints. Clearly that means tomorrow Leo gets out of jail. Jeremy Scott absolutely did it. There's still a lot. So that's just like the beginning of your investigation. And while it seems very promising, for the first time since 1987, you actually have a real suspect who is someone other than Leo Jr. or Leo Sr. here, right? Someone who is a viable suspect to actually begin to investigate. But there's still a lot of investigating to be done. And it is too quick to then just jump and say, absolutely, he did it. Especially when you have someone like Jeremy who obviously lived a crime-filled life, right? He did steal a lot of things. I mean, he stole rolls of coins. Whether it's because it was a crime of opportunity, that is still very disturbing. If what he says happened, his friend kills his own mother, and then he decides to steal some coins. I mean, there's like a level of just absolute unempathy, lack of empathy, that is very, very curious. What probably happened, or at least, what Bone Valley tries to implicate here, is that he probably had something to do with the murder. Whatever it is, he steals very little amounts of things. And so you can imagine that perhaps he was just stealing a radio. But let's look at what we have. So let's talk about the fingerprints. We said that the fingerprints were found on the inside window. They were specifically on the driver's door and on a lease agreement for a television in the rear hatch area of the vehicle. Now, these fingerprints were Jeremy Scott's, and it was a bombshell, but Scott had an excuse. He said he'd simply stolen from the car after he found it abandoned. Now, this would be fleshed out in the evidentiary hearing. So let's talk about the first evidentiary hearing. After these fingerprints were identified in 2004, Leo began the process of seeking a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. This falls squarely within it, right? The fingerprints we knew existed, but the identification of them, he did not know them back in 1987, not during his trial, not during the interim time. So typically, your time to appeal would have already passed, which he already did. He's already exhausted all his appeals. So all you have left in these situations, once you've exhausted your appeals and the time period in which to appeal, is you have to rely on newly discovered evidence. And we see a lot of these motions where the newly discovered evidence is not actually newly discovered, like it could have been known at the time. This is pretty clean. He did not know until 2004 Jeremy Scott's fingerprints were found inside Michelle's car.
And so this is an example of a judge getting something horribly wrong, because as Alan said, this is absolutely obvious. Of course he gets an evidentiary hearing, and of course the judge initially says, no evidentiary hearing, motion denied, which is why it took 7 years, because it had to go up to the appellate courts, and the appellate courts had to say, no, judge, you're going to have to it could be significant. And that's why I went back down for an evidentiary hearing.
Which is, the judge just got it wrong in the first instance. But finally, the law was right, and there was an evidentiary hearing. Now, you've already heard a little bit about this, but initially, Jeremy Scott denied any involvement in the murders. He'd be recorded on a jail call to his grandmother, telling her he had nothing to do with the crime. When he comes to that first evidentiary hearing, he is equally unequivocal. Yes, he admits that he broke into the abandoned car, and he admits that he stole from that abandoned car, but no one was in the car. He did not know Michelle. He did not touch Michelle. He did not kill Michelle. He didn't kill anybody. In a highly unusual event, John Aguero, the prosecutor who had prosecuted both Leo and Jeremy Scott, because they're in the same area, so same jurisdiction, John Aguero actually testified at the hearing. Aguero testified that he had Jeremy Scott brought to his office, and during his deposition, Aguero would say that he was, quote, sure a detective was present. But that detective's notes would later indicate that he was not at this meeting with Scott. There's no record of anyone else being present with Aguero when he met with Jeremy. And Jeremy would later say no one else was there. So they met alone. No witnesses other than perhaps a member of the sheriff's department who transported Scott up there for security. No lawyers, no tape recordings, really no record of any of this. Does this sound familiar, by the way? Remember, in a previous episode, we talked about how there are allegations that John Aguero met with none other than Leo Schofield without his attorney.
So we keep this podcast clean, so we don't want to get that E. And we like, for your kids to be able to listen to the podcast when they're in the car with you. But there are so many words that come to mind when I hear this. This is ridiculously inappropriate. This is amazingly the least bad judgment. Unethical is another word that comes to mind.
Unethical, bad. I mean, like best case scenario, stupid, right? Just like you didn't know better, but you know better. You definitely know better. And you know why we know he knows better? He lied about it. He says, no, a detective was there. I'm sure of it. Why would he say that if it wasn't a big deal that he met with any of these guys alone? The reason he lies about it is like the biggest no-no as a prosecutor to meet with a witness and certainly a potential target.
I mean, this is at best astronomically stupid. I mean, just mind-bogglingly idiotic that you would do this. That's the best you can say. Like, you should be fired for doing this, at least. Even best case, you're fired. Like, how could you do that? How could you meet alone with this person who has been potentially implicated in this murder? And I'll just say this. At the beginning, when I was listening to Bone Valley and Leo said that about him coming and meeting with him, I was like, I just don't think he would do that. I just don't think he would do it. This makes me question Leo that he would even say that. Then, from John Aguero's own mouth, he testifies about doing this, and it's like everything falls into place. He absolutely did that. He absolutely went to the prison and met with Leo and told him, if you'll just testify against your father, I'll let you out. It 100% happened. I have no question in my mind that it happened.
Here's the thing. We always say to look in the best light, that people are not trying to break the rules and whatnot. I think he's being incredibly lazy, right? Because it takes time to find a detective. And if there's a detective in the room, you can't kind of speak freely, right? You have to kind of filter yourself a little bit. And he, at best, I'm giving this in the best light, that he's not some crooked prosecutor or anything, would be that he is incredibly lazy. But the reason these things exist is to protect the potential defendant. It is to protect Jeremy Scott and Leo Schofield. And you don't get to decide unilaterally as the prosecutor that they do not have those protections of someone looking out for them, such as their attorney.
According to Aguero, we'll just, we literally could do a whole episode talking about how stupid this was, but we'll just move on. According to Aguero, he told Scott that they'd found his fingerprints in Michelle's car. Aguero said he told Scott, I put Leo Schofield in prison for life for the murder, and if he was wrong, he wanted to fix it. So he'd give Jeremy immunity for the murder if Jeremy just told him the truth. Jeremy, he said, denied having anything to do with the murderers, and this was when we learned that the fingerprints were in the car because Jeremy stole the stereo. Aguero said that he thought Jeremy Scott was telling the truth, and this despite the fact that Aguero had himself attempted to have Jeremy Scott put to death for the earlier murder, and in fact had gotten the death penalty for him before it was overturned by a jury. Other than Aguero's word, there's no proof this conversation happened or that an immunity offer was ever made. And I find this to be so incredible. I cannot tell you how absurd this story is. Like, I can't believe anyone thought that's how this went down.
And here's why. The offer of immunity is potentially something a prosecutor can offer. Just by the way, like when we're prosecutors, we can't just willy-nilly offer immunity. We have to like get many layers of approval above us because you do have prosecutorial discretion, but you don't, with such a big decision, you don't get to make it on your own. You have to get approval. And when you do something like that, it is a big deal in a case. That is something where you make sure you have it in writing, you communicate it through an attorney, because can you imagine conveying something as large as immunity just by word with no one else around? How is Jeremy Scott protected if he just withdraws it later on? There's no one there it's going to want to be the prosecutor's word against the potential defendants. I mean, you may have offered it, but you may have also been willing to say it never happened if that were the case, and that would be highly unethical.
Just the cascade of things that are happening here. So this prosecutor is telling us that he had this conversation with Jeremy Scott. Where's Jeremy Scott's lawyer? Jeremy Scott can't get up and leave. He's in prison. He's been brought there by armed guards to meet with his prosecutor. No one's there representing him. Where's Leo Schofield's representative? Like, why is this happening in John Aguero's office? If he offered him immunity, well, the DA should be able to testify about that. Remember, Aguero's just an assistant district attorney. He's not the main guy. So he offered immunity to a convicted murderer for another murder and never asked his boss about it? Never got like yeah, that sounds like a good strategy. Let's do that. I mean, the idea that this is how this went down, like I said, if he's telling the truth, he should have been fired immediately because this is so insane. And he has corrupted the whole thing through this action that he took.
And also just like, other than all of this that he should not have done, if it happened as Aguero testified, really, that was your whole investigation? I promised you immunity after, by the way, I definitely prosecuted you for murder and got the death penalty, and you're already in jail forever. Like, why? That's all the investigation you're going to do is like, yeah, man, just tell me the truth. Just tell me the truth. Come on, tell me the truth. I'm not going to prosecute you. And why would he say yes? Like, literally, what does he get? He's already in prison forever. Why does he need like another murder on him? Especially if, the prosecutor who prosecuted him previously succeeded on getting him the death penalty. How does he know it's not going to happen again in another one of the cases? Because he's kind of suspected in more than the murder he's serving time for.
Jeremy's going to tell this story about stealing stereo equipment. That's not something that only Jeremy would know. If Jeremy could tell us something about this case that no one else knows that would sort of account for his fingerprints or whatnot, I mean, that's more powerful. Aguero knows the stereo equipment was stolen. They noticed that when they found the car, that this stuff had been stolen. So it's not that hard to imagine Aguero saying something like, well, stereo equipment was stolen. You didn't just happen to steal that stereo equipment. Maybe that's how you left your fingerprints there, did you? Oh, yeah. That's exactly what happened. I stole the stereo equipment. I mean...
And also just like, okay, maybe if Jeremy was stealing stereo equipment on a daily basis, but we're not talking to him in 1987. We're talking to him decades later. And he's like, yeah, I remember stealing stereo equipment from that car. Like, how can you even remember if this is what you apparently did all the time, that this was the car? Like, why admit to it even? Say, I don't know how my fingerprints got in there. I don't remember that car. You can truthfully say that if you don't remember. I mean, none of this story makes any sense whatsoever.
But despite that, after this testimony, the trial court would credit the testimony of Scott and Aguero and would deny Schofield's motion for a new trial. And look, I mean, is that surprising? It is not surprising to me that the same court that said identifying the fingerprints in the car that are tied to someone who's been convicted of one murder and tried and acquitted for another one is not new evidence, we should have an evidentiary hearing. It's not surprising to me that once they had the hearing, the court was like, no biggie. I'm sure Aguero is telling the truth. Denied.
I mean, unfortunately, that wasn't a surprising ruling by the court. But there's another testimony from the evidentiary hearings that I think is worth talking about, and that is the testimony of Jamie Nellums.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Bombas makes the most comfortable socks, underwear, and T-shirts.
Warning, Bombas are so absurdly comfortable you may throw out all your other clothes.
Sorry, do we legally have to say that?
No, this is just how I talk, and I really love my Bombas.
They do feel that good. And they do good, too. One item purchased equals one item donated.
To feel good and do good, go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code Wondery for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/Wondery and use code Wondery at checkout.
So Jamie Nellums was Jeremy's girlfriend at the time that Michelle was killed and the mother of one of his children. Jamie was very familiar with the canal where Michelle was found because it was where Scott would take her to have sex. Now, Scott preferred to be outdoors, but Scott didn't just have sex with Jamie. He'd choke her until she was unconscious. He also was very violent towards Jamie. He would beat her regularly. Sometimes it was with his fist, a belt, her boots, and even with a baseball bat. In fact, Jeremy was violent with others as well, often pulling knives on people when he was angry. And Jamie came to believe that Scott would kill her eventually. And honestly, he might have, had he not been arrested for Donald Moorhead's murder first. Jeremy would deny having been violent with Jamie, saying he only struck her once with the back of his hand. It wasn't a big deal. Now, Jamie didn't just assert that she knew this canal area. Before the 2010 hearing, she took a detective to the very place on Highway 33 where Michelle's body was found. And this was interesting since in his discussion with detectives, Jeremy claimed he had no idea where Highway 33 was. But Jamie would testify, knew Lakeland like the back of his hand. And Michelle wasn't the only person whose body was found on that road. In 1986, a Jane Doe was also found murdered, only a couple hundred yards from where Michelle was discovered.
So I said we weren't going to talk much about it, but let's briefly talk about this cab driver, this 1987 murder of Joseph LaVere, because it comes up with Jamie Nellums. While Jeremy is dating Jamie, he tells her that he'd killed a cab driver and gotten away with it. Joseph LaVere was 25 when he was shot dead just outside of Intercession City, which is across the Polk County line. The murder was only 6 weeks after Michelle was killed on April 10th, 1987. LaVere's body was dumped after he was shot and the taxi was stolen. Whoever killed him crashed into a power pole and knocked out the power for the entire area. The murderer jumped out of the car. A crowd had started to gather, and he yelled, "The cab is about to blow," and then ran. The killer had brown hair. When Nellums met Jeremy a week after the murder, he dyed his naturally brown hair blonde. It was the only time while Nellums knew Jeremy that he dyed his hair.
I mean, there's a lot here, right? Like we also are doing what we said Linda's direct testimony was, where we're saying a lot of things. We're not tying them together. And part of it is because we were not looking into all of the crimes connected to Jeremy Scott. But there is enough there in this area, which, by the way, Lakeland sounds incredibly dangerous with these bodies and murders, a ton of them being found. But you cannot deny that at least there are bodies being found close to the area that is not an unknown place, but also not known to people who are just driving by. It is kind of a niche area, visited, as you may remember, by teenagers having sex or to do drugs, kind of do things that you shouldn't do, like in public, to be caught by the police. But it is a known area for people to go to. And what we know so far from Jamie's testimony is that Jeremy is very violent. We obviously know he's been convicted of Donald's murder. We have here her saying that Jeremy confessed to killing the cab driver, who, by the way, there's no one convicted of the cab driver's murder to this day. There were people charged and tried, but it was not Jeremy, and there's no one serving time for Joseph's murder. So let's go to September 29th, 2015. Leo's post-conviction counsel sends a letter to Jeremy Scott asking to speak further about the crime. Because you can imagine, if Leo's telling the truth, he is innocent of his wife's murder, and he is still looking for his wife's murderer. And if Jeremy Scott's fingerprints are in there, you can imagine just on a personal level, other than wanting to get out of prison, he may be interested in talking to someone who he may believe has killed his wife. On July 5th, 2016, Jeremy responds to this letter asking, "What's in it for me?" Which, by the way, isn't like a terrible thing to ask. Remember, he is spending life without parole in prison, and you have nothing to bargain with in prison, and we often see this with inmates for the smallest thing, even if it's not to be a witness in a murder investigation. They're always asking, what am I going to get for it? You know, something in commissary, you know, some extra time outside. What is it? So July 29th, 2016, Scott and Leo's post-conviction counsel, Andrew Crawford, speak on the phone. Also on this call is Sean Costas, a real estate attorney that Crawford has on the phone to listen just so that there's a witness to this call. They do not record the call. And Florida is a two-party state, and they don't want to ask. What that means is in some states, you can record on your end and not notify the other person. Florida has the rule that both sides have to agree to the recording. And rather than risk it, Crawford decides not to ask at all. That's why he has a friend listen in as a witness. Now, during this conversation, Jeremy tells the lawyers that he did kill Michelle. He says that he approached Michelle at a telephone booth in the rain and asked for a ride the night she was killed. She agreed, and after directing her to a, quote, hidden lake, which is presumably the canal area where her body was found, he stabbed her to death. After saying Scott will testify to this, he then refuses to sign an affidavit, and all we have are the words and notes of the attorneys.
And if you listen to Bone Valley, I mean, it's a frustrating thing because Jeremy, you know, he agrees to all this, and then they send him an affidavit memorializing it, and he won't sign it. And I will say this, I admit, I had a little schadenfreude about defense attorneys talking to someone, getting a confession, and then people being like, well, how do we know that you didn't tell him everything? How do we know you didn't feed him all the information? Because, of course, every time there's a confession to the police, the presumption is the police must have told them everything and told them all the information before they then recorded them telling it back to them. So you have these two defense attorneys who all we have is their word that Jeremy spontaneously tells them this without them leading him to it. Now, look, I don't think they're lying, but nevertheless, this is one of those things that will be mentioned by the state when they are pushing back on this, is how do we know how the conversation went? It's kind of like the Aguero conversation. Now, at least you have two people on this call. You have a disinterested person in the real estate attorney, but nevertheless, it sure would be nice to have a recording of this conversation.
Absolutely. So this is just obviously dashing for Leo that Jeremy Scott won't sign this affidavit. On January 2017, state investigators interview Jeremy Scott, and Scott tells them that he was off his meds at the time of his phone call with the defense counsel. He was so bad, he says, that he was smearing feces on the walls of his cell. And he told them he had no money, but that he'd admit to the murder for $1,000. So the state investigators do come talk to him and say, hey, did you say something like this? He's like, oh, I don't even know what I was saying. I was in such a bad place mentally because I wasn't taking my meds that I wasn't in my right mind. Smearing feces everywhere. Don't know what I said. Probably admitted to a murder if I could get some money because I have no money. Because remember, he's spending life in prison. He really has barely any family left. And I think at this point, his only family who's still in contact with him, his grandparents, I think maybe had passed away. In other words, there's really no one sending him money. So this is not unbelievable in terms of where he is in his current state. And on March 2017, the state conducted a video recorded interview with Jeremy Scott where he said essentially the same thing as he did earlier that year. And he reiterated his 2010 testimony, the one about he did not kill anybody, he stumbled upon an abandoned car, and simply stole the radio, which is why his fingerprints are on the inside of the car.
So in the 2010 evidentiary hearing, or 2011, whatever it was, he says, nothing, just stole the stuff, just stole the stereo. In 2016, on a telephone call, he says he did it. Now, one reason to believe he said that is because when the investigators came to meet with him, he didn't say, I never said that. He said, oh, well, I was off my meds when I said that, so can't believe that. In fact, what actually happened was what I said back in 2010. That was in March of 2017 when he conducted this video recorded interview. In September of 2017, Scott sends a letter to Leo's defense counsel. In it, he admits to killing Michelle. This obviously feels like a very powerful moment for the defense. Now they have in writing Jeremy Scott admitting to the murder. But on the same day, he sends a letter to the court reviewing Leo Schofield's case in which he admits to all the murders in Polk County in 1987 and 1988. And he requests that the inmates currently incarcerated for those crimes should be set free. So,
this is where it's really important to know the entire context, because if all you knew, which is not inaccurate, is that he admitted to murdering Michelle, boom, done, right? Let Leo out. But the whole letter read in context, you can imagine why the receiving court is saying, well, you can't just do that. You can't admit to every single murder in Polk County for these 2 years and just let everyone out. Like, that doesn't, that's not enough. And also, you can imagine that sounds coerced, or it sounds like something is not right with him mentally to be doing something like that. And in full context is what the court has to read that letter in.
And look, this is why, if you've been on Facebook, people will say things like, well, of course Leo's innocent. Someone else confessed to it. And that's
someone
not
confessed
enough.
to every murder in 1987 and 1988 too, and there are a lot of people in prison for that.
And as I always like to point out, Richard Allen also confessed. Jesse Miskelly confessed. Jay Wilds confessed. Brendan Dassey confessed. These are all people who confessed in highly contentious cases. And for some reason, those confessions aren't automatically true. When we talk about this case, it's like, well, Jeremy Scott confessed, so clearly Leo's innocent. But then when you look at how this went, it's like, oh my goodness, you if you're telling the truth in these confessions, you could not make it worse than how you're making it right now. So now this brings us to October 2017. After this letter is sent to defense counsel, the court wisely schedules a evidentiary hearing. Now, Scott is exactly how you don't want him to be when he gets on the stand. He's hostile. He's unresponsive to questions. Eventually, he's actually declared a hostile witness, which means that the person who called him, Leo's defense counsel, can ask him leading questions. This is not ideal. You would rather Jeremy just tell you the story of what happened, but he's going to try and get the story out of him. Jeremy will eventually say that he killed Michelle after she gave him a ride. So that's great. He basically repeats the outlines of the story that he had told earlier to defense counsel. But on cross-examination, the cross-examination is pretty brutal for him. And at one point, he is confronted with autopsy photos of Michelle. When he looks at those photos, he exclaims, and if you've listened to Bone Valley, you've heard this, "I didn't do that." So this is a big moment, and this is really the moment that the press, I think a lot of people took away with this. This was, in their view, a recantation. He had told the story of the murder, but when confronted with the photos, he said, "I didn't do that." Now, on redirect, so the defense counsel gets up, he tries to rehabilitate Jeremy Scott, and he reconfirms that he did kill Michelle, but that is not the takeaway from the hearing, and it is not surprising that on May 8th, 2018, the court denies Leo's motion. And shortly thereafter, Scott Cupp, who was Leo's former lawyer and a judge at the time, meets Gilbert King, and he approaches him about looking into Leo's case. And it's this conversation that would lead to Bone Valley.
So this is all very, very important, right? A lot of you who may have followed this case, and it's not inaccurate, but it's not the full story, is that why is Leo in jail if someone else has confessed to the crimes? We have not gotten a clean confession yet. And you don't necessarily need a confession. Well, actually, in this particular case, because the court already found Jeremy Scott's testimony to be credible, that would have been the instance in which the court could have done something evidentiarily. But other than that, after so many years had passed, if the court found his testimony credible, you probably did need a confession. There hasn't actually been a clean confession, right? There's the confession with no recording, and he refused to sign an affidavit. And then there was the subsequent investigation coming to him, and he says, nope, I was just off my meds when I said that. So that completely is undercutting his conversation with the defense counsel, which isn't recorded anyway. Then you have him writing a letter confessing to this and all murders in Polk County for a couple of years, and specifically requesting, let everyone else out. Is he just being altruistic? He's already in prison anyways. Might as well make some friends. Let everybody out. Whatever. The justice system is a joke. I can't believe I'm here. Open up the doors. Let's create chaos. Who knows why he did what he did? But you can't just pick out the one confession for Michelle. There's something else going there. And then you have the hearing where he says, yeah, I killed Michelle. But then there's that very, very important, I didn't do that, on cross-examination. And then it's rehabilitated. And this, so when you are discussing this case, there has not been a clean confession. There's all sorts of smoke. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is incredibly, incredibly gripping. And we are all following this, if you're listening to Bone Valley or following this timeline, like, what is happening? Like, it seems like something is there, but what can we do legally to get Leo out? He's already presented his newly discovered evidence that was denied. Then they have these follow-up investigations. And I do have to note this. These aren't just left alone, right? Once the fingerprints are identified, yes, there's a lot of procedural back and forth, and there's not an evidentiary hearing until 7 years later, but it's not because the state sat on it. It's because of the judge getting it wrong and them having to appeal up and then finally go back down to be granted the hearing. And then when the defense counsel say, hey, he just confessed to us, he won't sign an affidavit, the state actually does follow up. Maybe not to the speed at which Leo or the justice system may want ideally, but this is not a situation where the prosecution or the state is kind of sweeping it under the rug. There are things done to follow up. It's just, as you can see in these types of cases, there is a lot of messiness that's happening, and we have a jury that has convicted Leo for the murder of Michelle. And we can't just, on one person's recanted, letter to the court, let someone out of prison.
And it's doubly bad because he initially denied it. And the courts are pretty clear that if you have someone who initially denies involvement in something in an evidentiary hearing such as this, and then later on recants and changes their story and says, oh, never mind, actually I lied the first time, but now I'm telling the truth and I did it, there is a presumption against that person, because now they're telling you, well, you can't trust my first testimony because I lied under oath to you. I committed perjury back then, but now I'm telling the truth. You can understand why the courts would be a little bit skeptical of that. And you really need to bring it if you're going to do that. And Jeremy's, I think just the way he acted, frankly, really hurt. I think the way he acted in court, the judge is charged with assessing credibility. And, you have, look, and we say this all the time, Leo Schofield was convicted by a jury of 10 people, not 12, of 10 people, beyond a reasonable doubt. He has a heavy burden to bear at that point. He is presumed guilty at that point, not innocent. He is presumed guilty. And he needs this to be better. Now, Jeremy's going to get better, but it's unfortunate that it took him so long and that he did not tell the story he's eventually going to tell the first time he testified.
Right. So those of you who may be asking, there's newly discovered evidence. Game over. Leo gets a new trial. No. That's what the evidentiary hearing was for. Just because there's newly discovered evidence in general is not enough to get a new trial. You can imagine why. There's a spectrum of newly discovered evidence that may or may not have any bearing on the actual outcome of a trial. And that's what the judge was assessing at this time, was the credibility of Jeremy Scott's testimony. And so it was this hearing where he could have potentially been granted a new trial, but it didn't happen. And this brings us to March 6th, 2021. Jeremy Scott writes a letter to Gilbert King, who made Bone Valley, and he says that Polk County lied to him at first, but they didn't follow through. He said that's why he told the truth later. In this letter, Jeremy says he killed Michelle. He also mentioned the taxi cab driver that was killed by a 357 in his words, and says the investigators didn't want to hear about it. Now, this is unprompted. Gilbert King did not mention the taxi cab driver to Jeremy. He says that in February 1987, Jeremy said he went to Polk County. He says he stole a gun from a cop in Winter Haven, Florida, that he later used in the taxi cab driver murder, which was after the time that he killed Michelle. This is obviously another bombshell of a letter, and he's communicating not with the court this time, but with a journalist who's making a podcast about Leo Schofield. So Gilbert King sends back some stamps and paper to Jeremy and asks for more information on Michelle's murder.
I'll say this, Jeremy's really convincing on the cab driver. He is constantly confessing to killing the cab driver and never backs off of that. And he gives some pretty good facts. I mean, the stolen gun, the caliber of the gun. He talks about a hat. There was a hat left in the back of the cab and it had a Confederate flag on it. He says that was his cousin's hat. So it should be really easy to prove that Jeremy did this. We'll just look at the gun, we'll look at the hat, and who knows, maybe we'll get some DNA. It could be great, but unfortunately they destroyed all the evidence. So we don't actually have any of the evidence in the taxi cab driver case, so we can't actually compare it against what Jeremy is saying. Just another sort of oopsie in this case. So that brings us to May 16th, 2021. At this point, Jeremy Scott writes back to Gilbert King. He says that John Aguero told him that he would write on Jeremy's behalf for parole, and all he needed to do was keep saying how the fingerprints got into the car. Now, you may be thinking, Jeremy has life without parole. Well, weirdly, in the 80s, we've actually gotten more strict, apparently, in Florida. In the 80s, you could murder people and still get parole. That's why Leo Schofield, for instance, has been up for parole several times. So it's not totally unbelievable when Jeremy's told by the prosecutor, if it happened, I will help you get parole, that might actually be something that could happen, that maybe he could get parole. Now, it turns out that Jeremy's charges were written in a certain way that he probably couldn't get parole, but there's no way Jeremy would understand that. I mean, Jeremy is, as we've said, he has some intellectual disabilities anyway, so it makes sense that he might believe this, that he would help him get parole if he just kept telling his story. He said by the time he told the truth, no one believed him. He then lays out what he says is exactly how everything went down that night. So here's the story. He says it was raining that night. He was hungry, he'd been drinking, he was cold, and he was wet. He stopped at a gas station. He said that when he came to the gas station, he saw there was a woman on the phone. When she got off the phone, she asked him if he was lost or if he needed to use the phone. She also said something along the lines of she recognized him, that maybe she'd seen him at a party before, but Jeremy said he didn't recognize her. He said he was walking because he had no way to get back to where he was staying, and so the woman offered him a ride. They drove down Cumbie Road, and he was giving her directions of where to go. He told her to pull in down a dirt road with little trees and a creek in it. That's how he describes it. She turns down the road. She's driving down this road. It becomes very evident very quickly. This is a road to nowhere. And she says, there's no one here. At this point, he says he pulled out a knife to rob her. She freaked out. She tried to drive off. As she's trying to drive off, he throws the vehicle into park. She opens the driver's side door and starts to clamber out. That's when he says he lost it. Now, he doesn't remember exactly what happened at this point or how many times he stabbed her. He says that he stabbed her a bunch of times. He then rolls her up in maybe some plastic that he found. He takes her down to the creek and he pushes her into the water. He says he covers her with some wood trash. He says he doesn't know why there's no blood in the car. He can't explain that because it was a pretty brutal attack. He also says that he stole $10 that she had on her. He didn't steal any rings or anything like that. He then starts to drive the car away. He takes the car, he's driving down I-4 when all of a sudden the car stalls out on him. He pulls over and parks the car in the rain. It's about close to midnight at this point. At this point, he wipes down the car to get rid of any prints he might have left. He takes the keys and he locks the doors. He then walks up I-4 and up an exit ramp to where there's a gas station on the overpass. You may remember that when Leo Schofield came to the car, he walked up the same overpass to the gas station to call the police. He says he took the knife and any other evidence that had blood on it or anything else, and he put it in a dumpster. He then starts to walk back to the area where he lived, which was in between where Michelle's body was found and Sparky's gas station. As he's walking, he walks back by the car, and he thinks to himself, I should take the stereo equipment, because that is something he did. He stole stereo equipment. So he opens up the car, he steals the stereo from the front, he steals the power amp from the back where the hatchback is. That's why his fingerprints are on there, because although he'd wiped down the car, he ended up leaving some more fingerprints. He then leaves the car on the side of the road. He says he's telling the truth and he has no idea what else to do. He also says that the state attorney called him and told him that if he talked with King, he'd be in trouble, which is an allegation he makes that has never really been proven, but obviously is not true. He can talk to Gilbert King all he wants. I mean, I guess if he's admitting to murder, he could well get into trouble, but that is the story he tells.
Oh, okay. So Gilbert King gets this very detailed confession from Jeremy Scott. So subsequently, Gilbert King and his researcher, Kelsey Decker, visit Jeremy Scott in his prison. They essentially let him just talk. First, Jeremy gives a detailed confession to the taxi cab murder yet again, even though this is not the focus of King and Decker's visit. But Jeremy also reaffirmed about what he'd said earlier about John Aguero and his offer to help him on parole. Jeremy also says he told John Aguero that he killed Michelle. He says he pointed to the exact spot on an aerial photo where Michelle was found. And Aguero either didn't believe him or didn't care. Jeremy talked about Michelle picking him up in the rain, and he directed her to the dirt road, and that's when things went sideways. Jeremy had said that he just intended to rob Michelle and to steal her car. That was it. But he pulled out the hunting knife, one he'd taken from his uncle, and she tried to drive away in a panic, and that's when he put the car into park. It was at this point that he said he lost it and stabbed Michelle. He doesn't actually talk about the stabbing itself. It seems either he can't remember it, he blacked out, or he doesn't want to revisit it. He talks about details around the stabbing, but not the actual stabbing. He talks about after the stabbing, though. He talks about how he wrapped Michelle in plastic and that he put a piece of plywood over her body. He then got in the car and drove up, but it stopped about halfway to I-4. He had intended to go all the way to Kissimmee. Instead, he left the car behind because he couldn't get it to start again. Jeremy said he lives with the murders every day, and he sleeps with dead bodies, which is why he's now trying to confess even though no one hears him. Now, when he says this last part, it begins to make sense why he's talking about the taxicab murder. In fact, I think the taxicab murder is really interesting that no one is really specifically asking him about it, but he keeps talking about it. And to me, that is a much cleaner tie to him and the murder than Michelle's, because Michelle's is just his word. But we have potential evidence tying him in the taxicab murder. But the fact that he's telling them in conjunction with each other, and I find the taxicab murder confession to be also pretty convincing based on all the details that he knows to somewhat give further confidence to what he's saying here. But what we have essentially is he says what happened in Michelle's case in writing and essentially says the same thing when asked to repeat it in person, with Gilbert King and Kelsey Decker. We've talked about this where it's hard to tell the same story twice, right? You're always going to have kind of different things each time you tell it, even when it's true, just because there's different viewpoints, there's different things you remember. But we do have him here recounting pretty detailed things about the night Michelle was murdered, if he's telling the truth by him, both in writing and in speaking.
And it's interesting because he does add little things. Like he mentions going to Kissimmee. I don't think he ever explained why he was going to Kissimmee.
Is it not Kissimmee?
It is not Kissimmee, no. But
thanks for not laughing at me when I said it earlier then.
We don't really know why he's going there, but that's an added detail. You know, one thing he changes. We always talk about when you think about lies, are people lying? Why are they lying? Why would they change what they say? There's one thing I think he's absolutely lying about. In his first telling of the story, he basically says he was getting out a cigarette to smoke and his knife just fell out and Michelle freaked out. Okay, yeah, sure. Then later on, he changes that to he got the knife out because he was going to steal the car. The reality is he was going to rape her. That is what happened here. He took her down to that canal to rape her and she fought back. Now, he's never going to admit that. That is the lie he's going to stick to. And if everything else he's telling us is true, his reason for pulling out that knife is a lie. He was going to rape her and he doesn't want to admit it. And I think you can tell that when you look at it.
And here's the thing that thank you for pointing out kind of the big hole in his confession, right? Because up until now, the way he's telling it doesn't really make sense. How do you just all of a sudden black out and not remember anything? What led you from kind of 0 to 100 if it were just that she ran out of the car? Because in his telling, she's screaming and she's hitting him. Yes, I too would be scared with a knife if it were pulled, or I think it's pulled on me. But the fact that it turns into this rage killing makes a lot more sense if it were getting really personal, that she rejected him. And this would make sense how you'd be fighting back, right? A woman fighting back for her body is going to be very physical, very, very real, very loud, and also gets to the core of probably someone who wants to rape someone's very core of like, no, this is my right. I get to violate you. And that story makes a lot more sense, how you can all of a sudden go into this rage killing to have such an intense stabbing scene where, I mean, it's incredibly brutal. It doesn't really make sense if all she was trying to do was run from you. If she was running from you and you weren't going to do anything but steal her car, she's running from the car to take the car and leave. Why do you have to go stab her? It's because you wanted to rape her. That's what happened. And this also makes sense to me a little bit more. The story of what he may not remember is why there might not be any blood in the car. If she was fighting in the car, it's probably a bit easier to get on top of someone, not with the hindrance of, say, seats, console, steering wheel. What do a lot of people do? Pin someone to the ground so that they can have better leverage to have control over someone. These things are important. I don't know that that's what happened, but there are a lot of holes in his story, which if you take his story as is, I can understand why a judge listening to it doesn't quite find it credible. Now, here's where a good, cross-examination would come in, because I would be pushing him as to how did you get there? To better understand the story, if I know my job is to convince the judge about his credibility of his testimony. Because this story alone, there's just something missing. Why would this guy who just steals radios want to go into this massive rage killing and then wrap her body up and cover it up? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, it also, when you think about it this way, it feels like some of the questions that you had suddenly are answered, right? I mean, they kind of come together. Whether the story is true or not, you have two competing stories, you're trying to figure out which one is true. It's at least helpful if both stories explain some things. And I think Jeremy's story explains some things that people have wondered about. Let's talk about the way the body was found. So the body was found underneath some plywood. Jeremy Scott will say in his statement that he put plastic over it to cover it before covering that with some plywood. Now, there's no plastic wrapping found on the body, and this is obviously a discrepancy. But there's something interesting about it. Jeremy knew how the body was found, whether he did it or not, and that's because the detectives, helpfully, told him when they met him before the 2010 hearing that the body was found underneath a plywood box, board, whatever. That's the way they described it. Now, if Jeremy was just making this story up and using the information the detectives told him, why did he add in the plastic? Did he just mess up? He couldn't remember all the details of what they've told him? Or could it be that, in fact, there was plastic? The area where the body was found had a large amount of trash, including plastic wrapping that was never collected and never tested. What does plastic wrapping do? It floats. So it's possible that when Jeremy put her in the canal, eventually that plastic wrapping that he described simply floated away. Now, they also told Jeremy, the detectives did, that the body was found in a lake. Now, this is another discrepancy often cited when examining Jeremy's confession. The body was found in something more akin to a canal, not a lake. But one of two things seems to be true. Either Jeremy just has a habit of calling a body of water a lake, or the detectives called it a lake and this stuck in Jeremy's brain. In fact, in the initial police reports and in the initial media reports about the case, officers repeatedly referred to it as a water pit. Leo Sr. testified that he found Michelle in a, quote, little lake. It also appears that there is a lake there now. When Jeremy is shown pictures of the area in 2010, he talks about how back in the 80s, there wasn't no lake there, which also goes to the fact that he was very familiar with this area, and any notion that he didn't know the area wasn't true. Then there's the money. We know that Michelle made $13 and change that night in tips. We know both from the cashier at the gas station and from what Leo says she told him on the initial phone call. Remember, before there would have been any murderous rage or intention on Leo's part, that she spent $3 on gas. That would have left her with $10 and some change. Jeremy says he stole $10 from her. What about the change? The change is found strewn along the path where the body was dragged.
And during his first deposition way back in 2010, Jeremy Scott says that during his initial meeting with Aguero, they showed him pictures, quote, pictures I don't want to see again, that were of Michelle. The confrontation in the hearing wasn't a lucky break. The prosecution knew how Jeremy would react when shown the pictures of Michelle. Remember, it was that cross-examination. They knew how Jeremy would get real riled up about the state of Michelle's body. So much so that he might say something like, I didn't do that.
I mean, bully for the prosecution, right? I mean, they knew what would happen. That was not a lucky break for them. They knew it would happen. But I think, to me, lessens sort of some of the impact of it. What is the one thing Jeremy doesn't want to talk about? He doesn't want to talk about stabbing Michelle. This is a thing that he just doesn't want to discuss. He's seen those pictures before, and they were pictures he didn't want to see again. And then he's shown them again, and he freaks out. Could be because he didn't do it, and that's the moment where he says he didn't do it. Or it could be that this is all part of this psychology, how he is dealing with the fact that he murdered this woman. Let's talk about the cigarettes.
Especially in his own words, where he says that he sleeps with dead bodies every night. You know, that's a lot to deal with. So he has to have some coping mechanism, and part of that coping mechanism might be that he can't think about the actual killing of Michelle. And
let me just say this. Jeremy Scott's a bad guy who's done a lot of terrible things. If you listen to Bone Valley, you, despite yourself, or at least me, despite myself, I felt sorry for him by the end. Like the way he talks about this. He is a horribly violent, I think, irredeemable person as far as ever him being out in the world and you being able to trust that you'd be safe around him, because I think he just has violent tendencies he can't control. But he's not sort of the hardened killer that you might imagine not getting upset when faced with the things that they had done.
Absolutely. And by the way, most people are like that. Very few people have, the complete cold-hearted emotion, which is why it's tough with him, right? You can imagine having these competing feelings within yourself, why you would confess to something, recant it, then kind of in hopelessness say confess to every murder in Polk County altogether. You begin to understand some of his actions when you hear his own voice and kind of feel for him, despite all the incredibly violent things that he's done. So those cigarettes that Brett was talking about. Jeremy says after the murder, he pulled out a cigarette and smoked it. He was smoking Marlboro cigarettes, and a pack of Marlboro were found at the crime scene and photographed, but they weren't collected and they weren't tested for DNA or anything like that.
Another missed opportunity. Could have just been random cigarettes. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people out there.
Another missed opportunity. Right, another detail that he kind of just throws in there, that he he didn't have to say, that he may not even have known would have tied him to the scene, and he gives it. So it's just another little nugget that we have here and what we deal with it. It could be just a coincidence as well.
We're closing in on the end here, I promise. So did Jeremy Scott know Michelle or not? Remember his story. His story was that when she initially saw him, she said she remembered him. And this is what he says during his confession. Now, he says he didn't remember Michelle at all. Now, is there any evidence for this? Are there any witnesses who might be able to confirm it? Well, there is. And you'll never believe who it is. Alice Scott. Yes, that Alice Scott. She has returned. After Jeremy came forward and told his story, Alice Scott had an epiphany. She remembered that, in fact, she knew Jeremy Scott. And she told a reporter this, quote, "I knew Jeremy Scott. So did Michelle. I saw him over at Leo and Michelle's trailer at parties before Michelle was killed." Alice Scott. Always got to be in the middle of it. Now, look, maybe she did see him there. I kind of doubt it. There's nobody else who talks about parties at the Schofield trailer. But I think what this definitely shows is Alice Scott wants to be in the middle of this story, no matter what story it is she needs to tell.
This is not in the record or evidence at all, but I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that Alice Scott was not invited to these parties and she wasn't there. So for her to remember some random person who may have been at the parties, like, first of all, probably meant she was sitting at her bathroom window watching a party that she wasn't invited to, which probably tells you a lot about her, or that you just can't trust it. I mean, I can't imagine that she was at the party.
You're right. She's watching through the bathroom window. Question I think that should come up for anyone is, if Jeremy did this, why isn't there more blood in the car? Now, we're going to talk more about the blood here in a second, but one reason might be that Jeremy is left-handed. Now, I want you to think about the positioning of Jeremy Scott and Michelle. It's possible that from his position in the passenger seat, he wasn't actually able to stab Michelle until she had attempted to get out of the vehicle, and maybe even after she had gone out of the vehicle. Note that the pathologist testified that the first stab wounds were in the back. If Michelle opened the door and fled outside while Jeremy lunged at her from the passenger side, it's possible that none of the stab wounds really happened in the car, and that could be the reason that you don't actually see any blood in the car. Now, one place you do see it is in the dirt. And Jeremy says that after he attacked Michelle, she was lying in the dirt next to the car. As we've said, the blood is a weird fact in this case. You don't see it in the places you would expect to see it, no matter who did it. You don't see it in the trailer. You don't see it in the car, but you do see it in the dirt. You see a lot of it there. Now, obviously, if Leo killed Michelle, he could have put her on the ground at some point after he got her out of the hatchback. But if Alice Scott is telling the truth, then Michelle has been dead for at least a couple hours when he puts her on that ground. Her heart is no longer beating. Most of the blood she would have been lost by now. Of course, she might still leave some blood behind, but not the mass you see on the ground. But if Michelle fell out of the car and immediately afterward she was stabbed by Jeremy, who was then stabbing her 20-something times, the presence of so much blood right there, right outside of where the car would have been, makes perfect sense.
Brett, there is a lot. We got through the timeline.
We did.
But there is so much to discuss there.
Look, there's a ton to discuss here, and we packed a lot into this episode because we wanted to get all the Jeremy Scott stuff into one episode. I wanted you to have one episode where you could hear everything that happened with Jeremy, the whole sordid affair, and the story he tells. And we could probably talk about this for a really long time. And we're going to talk about it more in the next episode, where we're going to sort of walk through the competing timelines, the competing evidence, talk about what makes sense, talk about whether Jeremy can be believed, or whether or not this is a false confession. And if it is a false confession, whether or not, in fact, it is more likely that Leo did this. And we're going to talk about this from several different perspectives. We'll talk about it from the should Leo get a new trial perspective. Is there reasonable doubt? Should he be exonerated? Is Jeremy guilty, or is Jeremy a patsy? Is this just another instance in which Jeremy's sort of tragic life, which is filled with violence, but obviously was filled with violence towards him as well, is this another instance in which he is being taken advantage of in order to push forward a narrative that isn't true. We're going to address all that and more in the next episode. We've been going for a while tonight, though, and I know Alice actually doesn't feel that well. So I think we're going to skip questions for tonight and go ahead and wrap up. But Alice, is there anything else you want to share before we sign off?
There was a lot covered here. There was a lot that you may be angry about, but we will discuss theories next time. I would say remove the emotion from everything you learned today, because emotion may cloud some of your judgment, both with respect to Leo and with Jeremy. And think about what the evidence says so far, what the court was able to do when it was able to do it, and if it was enough, rather than kind of gut reactions. Because there is a lot to be infuriated about on multiple sides here, but fury itself is not going to help either Jeremy or Leo or whoever killed Michelle here. What we need to do is look at this with kind of precision and understanding of what next, because whatever has happened, we're already here, right? He's been denied a new trial. We are where we are. So what does this mean, and what does justice look like for Michelle?
We're going to talk about all those things. All those things and more. It's going to be so exciting. I hope you guys will join us. We love hearing from you guys. Y'all have been so engaged in this case. I hope you'll continue to let us know what you think. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. That's also the best place to leave suggestions if you want to hear something. Follow us on all of your social media @prosecutorspod. If you want to watch these episodes live, join Patreon. And even if you don't want to watch them live, you can still get them early and ad-free. We love our patrons. You guys are also great. Been so engaged. This episode, we finally made an episode interesting enough that even the people in the chat were listening to the episode. So I'm very proud of us, Alice.
That is true. The chats were all about the episode.
This is quite an accomplishment, so I'm very happy. And we'll be back next week with the conclusion of our look at this case. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Let me pause here. This is in the wrong place. Hold on. This is in the wrong place. I gotta move this.
Oh, yeah.
Give me a second. Alice, talk about your Odyssey.
I love my Odyssey. Did I talk about how I clean?
No.
Oh, okay. So I recently changed the configuration, which I love. I moved a child to the third row, and now I can't hear him. Because he's so far back. Displays of the planets, and whoever made the movie, it was fantastic and beautiful and based on NASA pictures, but they drew in these like little Martians on like when they were talking about Mars, and it scared all of the kids in the planetarium, so everyone started like screaming when the little Martians came.